We are live. Looks like we have a few attendees already in here. 23 now. We'll give it a few more minutes and we'll get started. All right, looking at a good amount of people here. A couple minutes past the hour. Started here in just a second. Welcome to all of you who are just joining us.
Let's go ahead and get started.
You want to kick it off? All right. Well, we'll get started here. I know more people are probably going to be trickling in here, but yeah, hello and welcome everybody to the team's Business Critical 5 Steps What You Should Do About It webinar hosted by ENow Software. I want to welcome each of you, as I know that many of you are probably joining from all over the world. So wherever you are, thank you so much for spending this time with us. My name is Bryce Sack. I'm the VP of Marketing at ENow Software, and I'll serve as today's moderator. Just a couple of housekeeping items as we get rolling here. This webinar will be recorded and will be shared following the event. So we always get a few requests asking about recordings. Don't worry, we'll get those to you. Also, if you have any questions during the session, please feel free, drop them in the chat, drop them in the questions section, and we'll be sure to cover those near the end. And if we don't have time to cover all of your questions, worry not. Our team will follow up with you individually and make sure that those questions get answered. Cool. So now I know we're all looking forward to discussing the 5 steps and other great team's content, so I don't want to take any more of your time. Let's get started. I want to introduce to you our speakers for today's session. First one is Joel Oleson. Joel is widely recognized as one of the world's most connected Office 365 and SharePoint community leaders. He was a key player in the launch of Microsoft's collaboration products from the beginning as the first dedicated SharePoint admin for Microsoft internal deployments of Tahoe and Office Web Server, and then later as an architect for the first version of SharePoint Online. And between us, I think he's got one of the best beards in the industry. And then I also want to introduce Jay Gadotra. Jay is the tech founder and CEO of ENow Software, is well respected within the Microsoft MVP community. Jay's extensive 20+ years of experience in unified communications, network management, and cloud computing is a driving force behind ENow's continued growth and success in delivering effective monitoring analytics software to clients worldwide. And I will say he's got a pretty good beard himself. All right, without further ado, let's get started. Joel, Jay, over to you.
Hey, thanks so much, everyone. It's great to be here. I think that this topic is very timely when you start thinking about Teams has just exploded. It's crazy how it's gone from being a nice little chat software, kind of the successor to Skype, and then it was like, okay, well, we can use this for files too, and there was a bunch of richness But man, if you go to any the Microsoft conferences now, they're talking just about how this is the new experience. This is where everything that Microsoft is doing seems to be surfacing up through Teams now. And I want to just say it's exciting to be here with you, Jay. I appreciate hosting this. I think this is absolutely timely. What a wonderful topic to be talking about today. And I've got you on mute. Yeah, we can't hear you.
There you go. Starting out with a tech issue already. I was just saying, super stoked to be partnering with you, Joel. Our intent here is to make sure that you guys walk away with practical information that you can use today, tomorrow, to make supporting teams easier. Joel has just a wealth of experience deploying teams. So let's get started. Let's get this thing rolling.
Awesome. So we talk about these 5 things. You're going to notice this slide a lot in this presentation, where we're going to walk through these 5 key things here. These are the foundation of when you start talking about business critical teams and the things you need to be focusing on. So as an example, and I'm just going to kind of high level cover these, and then we're going to dive deep into each one of them. So when it comes to running teams, especially from a telephony perspective, you really need to understand your customer. You need to understand what's going on in those conference rooms. You need to understand what's happening for your VIPs, what's happening for these individuals who are relying on this service. And Microsoft's provided the Teams Call Quality dashboard, and that should be kind of your key dashboard starting out when you're deploying Teams, because it's going to help you understand the service at a high level. And as well, you're going to be getting tickets, right? So whatever your ticketing system is, you need to wrap your head around customer support and ensuring that you're truly understanding what's happening on the ground with your users. And working our way around the wheel, we're going to talk about security and compliance, those policies, whether it's in the product itself from a policy perspective, or even Microsoft 365 service across the board with things like DLP, MIP, and which is now Purview. But we want to talk about compliance and how do you ensure that you're actually getting things secured in the right kind of way. Then we want to talk about life cycle. So from provisioning all the way to the end where you're just disposing or archiving your data. And you don't want to forget those things. A lot of them, they're not set up by default. So you actually need to turn on these services, set up your policies, understanding sensitivity, and so on. Now, operations, center of excellence, some may see this as optional. I see this as when it becomes business critical, you need to be on top of this. You need to be involved with the data. You need to understand what's going on. You need to be connected with what's happening from a Microsoft perspective. And Operations Center of Excellence is absolutely about understanding what's happening in the platform and keeping connected, thinking about adoption, thinking about things holistically. And the last thing's rounding it out, talking about teams monitoring and uptime. We're talking about how are you looking at this holistically? You know, if there's any issues, how are you handling communication? What kind of dashboard are you looking at? And what's exciting here is we've got ENow Software, who's actually has some solutions. We're going to be able to have an opportunity to see what do their dashboards look like, and as well, looking at this thing more holistically, how can we better understand and be connected with the data that impacts us most? Exciting. Let's move. All right, so the first one we're going to dive into is the Teams Call Quality. So here we're looking at essentially this is kind of when you're looking at this holistically, you start trying to understand teams. There's 2 key things to understand: reliability and quality. The reliability is focused on measuring that user's ability to make calls successfully and stay connected. On the quality side, we're looking at an aggregated telemetry across the board. Now, a lot of people would say, oh, it's up to Microsoft. There's not much I can do. Actually, there's a lot between the customer, that end user, and the actual service. So think about this from a service management perspective. How are you providing that service to your users? This is where your VPNs are, your network, those endpoints, the ISPs, the various hops that they're making to actually get there, all the way to what we call the front door, and trying to understand things from end to end. Now you can see in this little pie chart how really you've actually got about 3/4 on your side, customer responsibility, where absolutely Microsoft's responsible for the service stuff, but how do we look at this holistically? How do we look at it end to end? And like I said, there's your responsibility and Microsoft's responsibility. When you start thinking about this, it is your responsibility to be thinking about the service health. You know, Microsoft is going to try and provide to you what kind of impacts there may be across the Microsoft 365 stack. They'll say there's something that's degraded, or if they're having any issues, they're going to try and communicate that. Now, unfortunately, it may take them some time. Sometimes it may take up to 20 minutes or so to be able to get that out there and update the service. And so the more proactive you are, the more on top of things you can be. Think about this as well from an organizational perspective. There's always new features coming out. Staying on top of that, understanding adoption, assessing the usage, and understanding what's being used. And especially if you're relying on Teams in your conference rooms, which most of you probably are at this point, you may be using the Windows or Android-based team devices, and really trying to understand that, understanding those endpoints. And with any given call, you'll notice there's a little pop-up that asks, hey, you know, how was that call? Can you give us 1 to 5 stars? Those kinds of things will be buried unless you're actually building something or tying into the data. Regularly tapping into user sentiment and understanding that user sentiment over time is absolutely critical. You want to be able to dive into those 1-star calls or the 2-star calls. What's actually happening? Is it jitter? Is there feedback on the line? Is it a systemic issue? Especially when these are your VIPs, you need to be on top of that. What are you doing to manage quality of service on the network? Assessing and ensuring quality. There may be certain lines as people are going back to work. You're going to notice, you know, now you're getting more employees in, that certain things might be getting saturated, and especially with the apps. And there may be some software that hasn't been updated in a while. Updating drivers. You got to stay on top of those endpoints, and especially as it relates to these key devices and your VIPs. What are you doing to stay on top of that stuff? And ultimately, obviously, you need to be managing this thing. Let's move on. All right. So here we're looking at the call quality dashboard. And essentially, in the Teams Admin Center, you can pop down. It's actually the last option on the left in your nav. This is the call quality dashboard. If you aren't familiar with this, major call to action, you need to set up the call quality dashboard. And essentially, after you've set it up, then you need to upload your building, your endpoints, information about your tenant. There's some instructions here. You're wondering, hey, can I get this deck? Absolutely, you can get the deck. So all these links here, you can absolutely dive into. The other thing is Microsoft has built some Power BI templates for being able to drill in a little bit further. But I actually want to hand things over to Jay, and we're going to dive into a call quality dashboard before we even do that. If you want to go ahead.
Thank you.
Dive into this. But
Yeah, thank you, Joel.
sure.
Can you see my
So
screen? Okay.
I can see your screen. Looks good.
Awesome.
So what you're going to notice is there's tabs across the top when you're looking at the Teams Call Quality Dashboard, the CQD. We've got the overall quality, and you'll notice the good is the blue, the whiter the red is your poor calls, and especially you can kind of see over time that little the percentage of bad calls. You can see any given day that it was really poor as well over time. So that must have been a pretty bad day right there in the middle. You can see where there's a spike on the poor percentage of calls. That was, pretty significant day. And as well, you can see that red bar there. So that's an example of a day you could dive in and say, what happened on that day? Was that a Microsoft issue? Was that something going on our corporate network? But as an example. So let's actually look at the server tab. And you can see that you've got to add your networks or else that's not going to be populated. That's pretty typical. A lot of customers, especially when it comes to Teams, is they don't, they're not network admins. They don't have all this telemetry data, or they don't have all these systems. You're trying to troubleshoot an issue and you get to this tab and you're like, oh man, I have no idea what's going on, and the CEO is breathing down my neck, right? Well, let's look at the client. This is where you'd upload your endpoints. Same deal, not populated. Unless you are on top of this and can add those networks and add the information about your clients, that's not going to be populated. And let's look at this voice quality SLA. Uh-oh. Again, we don't have this stuff populated because the onus is on us. Microsoft's not going to pre-populate all these dashboards. And so this is actually a pretty typical customer who hasn't yet uploaded all that additional data. And even when you do, I want to just say, this is a space where Microsoft does rely on partners. If you're really trying to run business critical teams, this is absolutely an opportunity to partner with somebody like ENow Software, who can help you get a dashboard to be able to then better understand what's going on and in a simplified way. I'll hand this over to you, Sam.
Yeah, thank you, Joel. I think the challenge here is when we started looking at what Microsoft provides, and it's a great start. Highly recommend that if you don't have this set up, we purposely had these left out so that way you could see the gaps. It does give you some visibility, but where you have some challenges is if you quickly want to know how is Teams performing for your organization from Microsoft's perspective. So Microsoft has all this great data. How is the organization performing? How is jitter? How are the key performance metrics for your organization? And then there's a second layer, which is how do users feel their Teams call quality experience is? That's a different question. Sometimes the Microsoft side can't catch an issue. I've had poor calls, but they were labeled good inside of Microsoft. So that's another layer that's not provided here. And then lastly, how do you help improve a user's experience? When you look at what happened during the pandemic, one of the positive outcomes of the pandemic was the fact that organizations were able to break down barriers and Teams adoption soared. I would say at this point, Teams has probably become the centerpiece. It used to be email. Now organizations and users depend upon Teams. So the need to have that visibility, the need to understand how users are performing, the need to be proactive is absolutely critical. So we thought about those questions and we said, okay, as a software vendor, how can we go about solving these challenges? We've been in the monitoring space for over 18 years. I am not that old, but I started at a young age. We've been working with Microsoft 365 or Office 365 actually since its inception, working with BPOS before. So we sat back and said, okay, how can we solve those challenges? Our solution to these is we've created a simplified call quality dashboard. And what it's designed to do is give you a bird's eye overview of how Teams is performing for your organization from the data that Microsoft is collecting. We've simplified that data down into the key essential KPIs around reliability and quality. Things like jitter, when your users complain that they sound like a robot. Maybe it's poor calls being dropped, poor audio stream. What this does is it gives you a view over the past 30 days and comparing that to the last 30 days, are we improving as an organization against these KPIs? So it takes all that data and makes it really simple to answer the question, how is Teams performing from an organizational perspective from the data that Microsoft provides in the Teams Call Quality Dashboard? Now, as to that second question, how do my users feel Teams is performing? What we've done is we've aggregated the rate my call. I think it's every 4 calls or so you get the 5-star rating. If users are putting in 1 or 2 stars, as you can see here, the data looks good at the top, but in actuality, something has happened. My users are saying it's a 1.25, what's going on? So this view that we've created, the simplified Teams Call Quality Dashboard, really helps answer those 3 questions. Now, what happens if you have a problem like we have here? Well, what you can do with our software is we have something that we've introduced called Teams VIP monitoring. With Teams VIP monitoring, and Joel, you and I spoke about this when we were preparing, we both have PTSD over getting yelled at by executives. Anyone who has supported technology knows, I don't want to give executives a bad rap, but executives tend to have, don't have as much patience. They have a huge load. I think we've all who've ever been in IT have felt the wrath of an executive who's trying to get month-end numbers out, trying to take care of a critical task, and they're just frustrated. So sometimes they take that out on us. What we've done with the Teams VIP monitoring feature is given you the capability to be able to signal those users out, be able to identify, okay, I have an executive who's telling me his Teams call quality performance is terrible. How can we go ahead and be proactive? So what this does is it actually will flag the number of poor calls that Microsoft calls out. We've actually taken this a step deeper. If you're on a conference call and an individual has a bad experience, Microsoft will log that as you've actually had the bad experience. So we strip that out for you, and we only log the poor calls that Microsoft is logging, but it's cleaned up. And then we give you the ability to alert on that. The second thing we do is we take the rate my call feature, we also aggregate that and give you the ability to set up an alert. So now you can get more proactive. So what happens if one of these alerts goes off and you want to troubleshoot it? Well, you can drill down into the user. This is actually my call quality data. And you can see here over the last 30 days, we've aggregated some things to help you understand, why is Jay having bad calls? Well, 12 of my calls were bad. I had about 6 conferences that were bad. That's not a good number. It's about 18 bad calls. Well, what was the reason? Microsoft is reporting that 61% of it was caused by the network. And then when you drill down further, you can see 38% of the time I was on Wi-Fi. I was wired for 38% of the time. The large portions of my calls took place because I was on my iPhone, which is coincidentally, I was in a third world country. I was in Mexico, and the network there wasn't great. So that's why I had so many bad calls. You can see this here. I was on my iPhone and I was wireless most of the time. This other section here makes it easy to see. Maybe you have a user that is having problems with one particular user. I have a wide assortment of calls here, so this is not a great example. But what if one person is, like me, was in Mexico? Now you'd be able to isolate and correlate, okay, this person's having a problem because they were on a wireless network, they were in a bad location, and maybe they were talking to one particular person. You can further drill down and actually see the calls. We've stripped out all the only the bad calls. Inside the CQD, it's hard to filter just on bad calls. We've also kind of filtered out the meetings and conferences so you can further drill down. What's really cool is not only do we have the Teams VIP monitoring, but we've also introduced another feature called the Teams CQD support portal. And what this does is it gives you the ability to get the same view, except now you can go ahead and flip to different users, any user in your organization. Then on the fly, you'll be able to make these correlations and talk to a user and say, hey, John, I noticed that you're always making calls wireless. This could be because you're always at a Starbucks when you're making a call. So this gives you a lot more capabilities around supporting Teams. The Teams Call Quality Dashboard from Microsoft is awesome. This just takes it a step further. It saves you time. It makes it a heck of a lot easier to be able to troubleshoot, support those VIP users, and really just make your day overall better.
That's pretty interesting. Yeah, I think that if they were looking at my calls, you'd notice just how many I'm taking off my phone. I like being able to walk around, that's for sure. All right, let's flip this forward. So what are you going to notice when you start diving into these issues? Some of the most common Teams performance issues: incomplete firewall, proxy configuration, poor Wi-Fi, bad bandwidth, issues with the VPN, inconsistent or outdated client drivers or versions, unoptimized built-in audio devices. If you think about the devices and issues with devices, absolutely. And then your problematic subnets or network devices, congestion, all sorts of different things from a routing perspective as well. I've seen a lot of routing issues where people are just going all the way back to wherever their headquarters is, through trying to get to the internet or trying to get to where Microsoft is. And absolutely, any kind of deployment you're going through, you should absolutely look at your network and how that is going. Microsoft's pretty consistent about their service, but a lot of these issues are if you could simply know what's going on and be able to understand which areas or which users, you can know where to spend your time, know where you need to optimize your network or fixing routing issues, updating clients, and things like that. Let's move forward. All right, security and compliance. There's a lot we could talk about here. I'll probably go a little bit faster than we've been going, but this is one of the on one of the Microsoft websites here related to security and compliance. Here's 12 things you can do around security and for being able to support this work from home. A lot of these apply to work as well. When you start talking about MFA should be there from the start. All your admins, now it's actually required in the tenant to have MFA or on your admin accounts. But think about that from a perspective of even your VIPs. You got to be really careful about that experience. Think about this, approaching this from a zero trust perspective. If you're not familiar with zero trust, absolutely go dive into zero trust. And I'm not going to dive into all of these, but I want to say most people are not thinking about this from a threat perspective. Most people are not looking about this and looking at those CAS policies. You may actually have rights to be able to take advantage of things like DLP and MIP. And it really surprises me how few customers are taking advantage of DLP. We're talking about the data loss prevention, where you can actually block credit cards from being shared in chat or shared in files that people are uploading. So from a Teams perspective, there's actually two levels here. The chat DLP, which is E5, and then DLP on files and attachments and so on, which is leveraged through E3. So you can take this from even kind of the base level. Some of these security features are baked right into the platform, but they're not turned on by default. So think about this from an endpoint perspective, Defender, what are we doing for antivirus? What are we doing to protect the clients? All the way to the service itself and monitoring threats, being aware of what's happening, training your users. And absolutely, I think about things like MIP, this Microsoft Information Protection, and Purview. How are we training our users to actually take advantage of this? Do we have any labels in place? Let's move on. I just feel like sometimes there's so much the Microsoft is building to make sure the platform's secure, but there's so many customers who don't realize they need to turn these things on. So here's just a high-level overview of looking at leveraging policies across Azure AD. That's where your security essentially comes in across the Microsoft 365 platform. We can leverage Microsoft 365 groups. There's what we can do from a policy perspective for emails. There's DLP policies for email, as well as for our chat, as I mentioned, and as well for the files. So you think about looking at this environment across the board. When you think about Teams, Teams is not just Teams. Teams is really a substrate. Underneath it, you've got SharePoint and Exchange and OneDrive. And we'll talk about that a little bit further. But when you start talking about securing teams, it really does require more of a holistic approach to looking at your data and understanding where your data is going and where it should be encrypted, or where you need to be considering sensitive data from your policy perspective, a labeling perspective, even legal perspective. Let's move on. Now, just kind of if we're looking for action items, here's an action item. Do you know your secure score? If you don't know your secure score, you should absolutely spend some time tracking that down. Go figure out, you can run secure score on your tenant and it'll give you a score. And it's actually going to give you recommendations. You're going to get points, and you're going to be able to see history of where you've been, and you're going to be able to make progress. Let's move toward that zero trust approach in security. And again, take some notes. This is the place where you need to be thinking about where are you and how do we move the needle. Microsoft Secure Score is a great place to go and start. Spend some time. What are we doing for our identity from a security perspective? What are we doing for our data from a security perspective? How about our devices? And what about our apps? What about our infrastructure? So again, looking about holistically, much of what you're going to see in Secure Score is not Microsoft moving the needle. It's you guys moving the needle. It's the customer. Let's move on. So with teams, I talk about this kind of this substrate. Essentially, under there, you're going to find SharePoint. So they're securing SharePoint, your documents. Think about this as well from a privacy perspective, your private channels. And absolutely thinking about this from a sensitivity label perspective, encryption, permissions, who can view, what about devices? Are we blocking any devices? So essentially, you need to think about these from a labeling perspective and how you're going to isolate your sensitive content. Otherwise, by default, everything is treated the same. So let's move. There's a lot here. I think when it comes to governance, a lot of people can get overwhelmed. I like to break things down into pillars of who should be able to create the teams, who should be able to create sites, who should be able to create these libraries or private channels and the shared channels. Thinking about this from a naming convention perspective, what are our standards? What about external sharing and guest access? Those may be not on by default. It may be that there's a ticket they've got to request. What's your process for being able to handle external sharing? What's this policy on OneDrive? What's the policy on SharePoint? What's the policy in Teams? Expiration and archiving. What is that disposition experience? What about legal holds? How are you handling this from a legal perspective? Now, what can really be a major step forward is setting policies and taking advantage of sensitivity labels, retention labels. How long should this data be kept around? And which will set you up for e-discovery. And even from an e-discovery perspective, how many people have you got in there who have e-discovery rights? That means they've got rights to all the data in your environment. So you got to be very sensitive about who have these roles and where are they around the world, and what are you doing from an auditing perspective. But even legal holds perspective and disposition. Again, those security features of DLP and MIP come back up with Purview, and your ability to do encryption or your ability to do watermarking on your files, and thinking about things more holistically from a security perspective. Big fan of templates. It can help you from a productivity perspective. How are you managing your apps and the App Store? And then the administration experience. There's a lot to kind of get your arms around. The Teams Admin Center, the SharePoint Admin Center, Office 365, M365 Admin Center, that adoption pack. There's some good stuff in there if you're wondering, hey, do I have my arms around my environment? And then there's some even reporting you can get. And don't forget Azure AD Portal as well. But again, kind of a last reminder on this slide across the bottom, all data is not equal. So let's figure out, how do we establish a baseline for some of our teams? For most teams, and then figuring out how are we handling those more sensitive and then the most sensitive, that highest level of protection. I recommend at least 3 levels for being able to really start to do enforcement of sensitivity and encryption and so on. And I'm going to just fly over this one. I can't dive too far into sensitivity, but absolutely keep up with regulations in your industry. Think about things from a privacy perspective. Think about chat, think about the files, think about the emails. So you want to have a holistic approach to how you handle governance, monitoring, assessing risks, and protecting identities across the board. SharePoint, Exchange, and OneDrive are the underlying aspects of Teams. So let's go into the lifecycle bit. And we've started to touch on this a little bit. When you're approaching Teams, there is that ability for users to create teams by default. There's the ability to create SharePoint sites by default. What does your service look like? Do you want to create a workflow? How do people request these things? Should people be able to create them out of Outlook to be able to create Outlook groups, which then as well provision different aspects? So you want to make this straightforward and easy to understand. And I think that idea of establishing a service so that it's easy for people to understand what is the service that's being provided here, how can I find out more information? All your users aren't just going out to Microsoft.com to go learn about the Teams offering that is your Teams offering, because your policies make your Teams environment different than anyone else's. So it's important to absolutely establish what is your service offering. How do people request Teams? My recommendation is that it's not just on by default for most corporations. Small, medium, maybe it's not a big deal. Enterprise, you really need to be thinking about life cycle. How do things get provisioned? What does that request process look like? Is IT or HR involved in some kind of workflow? And then it goes on to exist. It's being used. What are you doing around monitoring? What are you doing around compliance, e-discovery, and so on, through the life cycle all the way to archiving and disposition? And I mentioned earlier, your data will just continue on unless you turn on some kind of archiving. Hey, it hasn't been used in X amount of months. Let's make sure that we're actually setting up archiving. And with archiving, you can have stuff essentially be in an archive mode for 30 days before it then can get deleted, expired. And with legal holds, you want it to respect that. And I highly recommend testing and validation through this entire process. But what I don't recommend is going with what's default. Default is not a way to live in this life cycle space. All right, next. So let's look at this Operations Center of Excellence. And this really, I think this you have to step back from Teams and look at Teams holistically. And let's just tap this one more time, the little advance, so I can show. When you think about Teams holistically, you're really looking at M365 holistically. Teams has apps across the board. What's fantastic about Teams is that's where everything you're doing in M365 can really make itself known. It's a great way to be able to navigate across things. If you're in SharePoint, you're likely just living in SharePoint. If you're in Exchange, you're living in Outlook. But with Teams, you have the ability to have a single interface and be pulling in things from Viva Connections and Viva Topics and Viva Learning and Viva Insights and hundreds of apps, including the plethora that is in M365, as well as the hundreds that are in the Teams App Store that are actually written by those companies themselves. These aren't, the Rike app is built by Rike. The Trello app is written by Trello. The ADP app is written by ADP, and on and on. What's really kind of cool here is you actually have a very rich ecosystem where you can essentially reduce the number of clicks and have a very rich Teams environment. Now, when we start talking about this from a COE perspective, you're likely to say, how are we supporting apps? And we're not just thinking about those third-party apps. We're thinking about the enterprise, your own apps, the apps that are created in Power Apps, the dashboards that are created in Power BI, the flows that are created in Power Automate, the virtual agent chats, and so on, and on as Microsoft continues to add more to the Power Platform. But even when you start talking about what your developers are building, likely they are not just living in SharePoint, doing SharePoint development anymore. They're actually looking at how can we build interfaces into Teams with Visual Studio Code, or building their repositories into GitHub, and leveraging Azure and Azure DevOps to really build out a rich ecosystem and integrating what's most business critical in your environment. Now, when we talk about COE, it's about how do you get your arms around this. So let's advance here. So this app on Teams, we've got tabs, we've got bots, we've got extensions and tasks and webhooks. You can do really a lot with leveraging Graph in Microsoft 365. There's the bot framework, the SharePoint framework, where if you're writing a SharePoint app or web part, essentially you can make it so that it snaps right into Teams as well. And we already talked about how Power Platform absolutely has apps, even first-party apps that you can build right inside and right in the UI, right inside of Teams. So don't just think of Teams as a chat app or the third parties. Think about how the enterprise can actually leverage this for business critical management. Move on. So what is Center of Excellence? What is the COE? This is bringing together like-minded people with similar business goals around knowledge sharing and success, establishing standards, consistency, governance. You know, back in the day with governance, we used to talk about these stakeholder committees. Essentially, this is a look at operations and saying, hey, wouldn't it be great if we could pull the network folks together to dive in on what's happening on our networks? Let's actually establish a center of excellence where we can bring the engineers together and say, hey, here's where we're at and here's where we want to go. Microsoft has actually built a Power Platform COE starter kit. I'm not saying you use all of it, but there's a lot of really cool things in there. A lot of these things are now being incorporated right into the product. But the idea is developing a strategy around adoption and support for these makers, these folks who are actually building apps, and understanding connectors, whether it's connectors in Power Automate or connectors to be able to get access their data. You think about the Dataverse. Who has their head around Dataverse? Being able to understand these enterprise critical apps. You're connecting to Oracle now. This is no kid game anymore. We got to make sure that this business critical data is absolutely being monitored, managed, and the people who have access to these apps are the people who should have access to the apps. Let's advance. I'm going to show you one of these dashboards that I'm talking about. Here we are looking at the COE starter kit, and you can actually see right in this interface, here are makers. These are the people actually building these apps. Megan Bowen is going nuts. She's built 198 apps. Wow. And you can see the apps distribution here. We can actually dive further in on these apps. On the left-hand side, we can see the environments and which environments have the most apps. Huge fan of being able to create these environments for our line of businesses. We should have a productivity environment where the average end user might be using that default environment, but how do we actually get LOBs who want to use special connectors into their own environments where they can be then managed and governed? We can actually have rules around the environment, around the apps, better drill in on our flows and connectors, better understand who are these people who are making and publishing apps and how are they being used, and really being able to understand and get our arms around these Power Platform environments. So I even just like this high-level overview of here's all the stuff you're not thinking about. Here's the things that are going on in your environment that if you could see, here's things you can drill down on and better understand the business critical nature of what's happening in your environment. Move on. Now, I don't think we have time for this video, but I just want to point out that there is a video called the Center of Excellence Starter Kit, and it's actually quite good. Let's actually move past this, but just kind of recommendation for those of you who are trying to better understand COE, both from a anyway, trying to wrap your arms around what's possible with the COE and the COE Starter Kit. Some really good recommendations. And this last section, we want to talk about teams monitoring. Really is trying to understand what's going on in the environment and being able to evaluate. I'm going to reinforce this one more time. Teams is not just teams. There's the team substrate of like what is in a team and what is that Azure AD group that actually pulls together these set of individuals. You've got your owners, you've got your members, you've got your private channels and your shared channels and so on. But there's teams, but right underneath teams, you've got the rest of M365, the SharePoint for your collab side and your apps. You've got Exchange for the mail capabilities, even the chat from an archiving perspective. And you've got OneDrive when you're sharing a file between two individuals, or like me sharing it with Jay, that is going to go through and be shared from my OneDrive. So essentially, you really need to understand that architecture and be able to, what about managing and monitoring that infrastructure? And I'm going to hand things to Jay to help us better understand what's possible with this partner ecosystem. And you're muted.
Here we go again. One of these days I'll get the mute button working.
That is the most common thing in Teams, by the way. I think that people are like, how can I just, hey, when I'm talking, let me talk. When I'm not talking, mute me.
You think with the pandemic, I would have a lot of experience, not a lot of experience with GoToWebinar though. I want to start first by talking about how things have changed. In the old days, the challenge when you had on-prem technology was learning that technology. Things move slower. Everyone would wait to Service Pack 2 to deploy something. You'd have to convince management that you wanted to go to the next version of Exchange, SharePoint, Link, whatever the technology was. And then the challenge was getting the different departments, the different silos within an organization to configure Link, to work with Exchange, to work with SharePoint. And a lot of organizations struggled with bringing all those pieces together to deliver the vision and the unified experience that Microsoft wanted to give users. So the full value of the software wasn't realized. And the job of the IT admin was largely dealing with migration, supporting it, being proactive, monitoring the system. In the 365 world, Microsoft's taken a lot of the complexity away. Now everything just works, but now there's new challenges. And the complexity, I would argue, has actually increased. Things like being able to configure 365. You've spoken, Joel, about governance and adoption and controls in place. What we've seen is, if for the early adopters who didn't realize that was going to cause a problem, now they have a big cleanup problem, and that creates security challenges. There's end user training challenges. And then when it comes to troubleshooting and monitoring, there's even more complexity because you have less visibility now to be able to see things. So what we've done here at ENow is we've created a dashboard view where you can see your on-prem, your hybrid, your 365 workloads all on one single screen. This is designed so that people in the NOC, whoever you want to share this with, can have a view of what's happening in the organization. We've taken things that can cause issues. Like one of the first questions we get, and what many people get, is when there's a service disruption, how do you know if it's a Microsoft problem or if the problem's on your side? And if the problem's on your side, is it the network? Is it the hybrid components? Is it the person's device? Is it their desktop? It could be a myriad of things. So what we've done is we've kind of laid out on our dashboard the network, hybrid components, the workloads. When it comes to being able to troubleshoot, whether it's a Microsoft problem or me problem, that is a very important question. We've seen some organizations early on in their journey to 365 mistakenly conclude that it was a Microsoft problem. And the problem with that is if you think it's a Microsoft problem and it's on your side, the issue's never going to get fixed. So our goal is to help you be proactive, be able to understand what's happening in your environment, and really put you on the offensive. So some of the ways that we do that are, we have a simplified service health dashboard. What we've done here is we've taken the service health dashboard and made it super easy for you to see and see what's going on and get alerts. Not only do we have the service status, but as you scroll down, we have the incidents, the advisory alerts, the history, and you can drill into each of those. But what's really handy, and this has come from user feedback from our user community, we were the first vendor to incorporate this into our solution several years ago. We had found that when people go to the native tools like the Service Health Dashboard, they find that it's delayed. And so they really don't use it. So what we've done is we've learned that they would go to Twitter. And so we've integrated Twitter right here on our screen. So you can quickly see, well, if people are blowing up on Twitter, I now know very simply that Microsoft's having an issue. Another way that you can kind of see if whether you're having an issue, if it's on your side, is through our network monitoring. So in our network monitoring, we give you the capability to look at all the different workloads. And then what you can do is you can drill down a little bit lower and actually see how is that particular workload, those endpoints performing. Now, this is not a networking tool, but the idea is to give you that visibility. And then when you couple that with our end user experience probes, where you have different locations, some of our clients have offices all over the world. If they're having a network issue, the indicator will light up here. And now you can understand, okay, now I'm having a network challenge. When it comes to the other workloads, you had mentioned that Teams is heavily reliant upon Sharepoint and OneDrive. I personally had an outage with Sharepoint back in November. I was trying to access a file, wasn't able to access it. At that time, I had global admin rights, so I went back to got access to the file, didn't think anything of it. And then I was talking to one of our clients, and they had mentioned that there was a Sharepoint outage. So what we had learned was our monitoring at the time didn't catch it. So we went in and since have added very detailed end user experience monitoring, being able to search for a site, create a folder, rename a folder, upload a document, search for a folder. Can't go through all of this now, but the extensiveness of these end user experience actions that we're taking and we're testing, not only are we testing if the user can perform these actions, we're also measuring from a network standpoint, how is it performing? And we do that for SharePoint, we do that for OneDrive. You've seen what we do for Teams. So it is pretty comprehensive, it is pretty deep, and it gives you the ability to have that visibility. Now, in addition to the monitoring that we provide, we also have a reporting engine that helps with governance, that helps with adoption. If you have a Microsoft EA that is coming up and finance is coming to you to ask you, what are people using? What licenses do we need? How many duplicates do we have? How many inactives do we have? We have a range of reports that give you that visibility. But essentially what we're trying to do is really make your job easier, give you the visibility that you don't have in the cloud, and then give you the assurances that the underlying components for Teams, SharePoint, OneDrive, the network, all of that's working for you and really help you get on the offensive so that when there is an outage, what you're not having happen is the help desk is being flooded with calls, you're doing a crit sit, everyone's looking around and saying, okay, where is the issue? That is essentially the problem that we like to solve, Joel. You're on mute now. Gotcha.
Oh man, you did get me. Yeah, this is really cool to be able to look at this and understand things more holistically. I think that there's a lot of customers who wish they had tools to be able to drill in in a very simplified way. It was great. And let's come back to the slides. All right. So when I talk about myth and reality, one thing that I've found with M365, there's a lot of customers when they first approach it, they read the SLAs and they're like, man, we don't have to worry about this now. It's great. Microsoft's going to be able to monitor and manage our services. What they're not understanding is that even if Microsoft is saying, hey, we're going to give you 99.99%, that's not reality. That's a goal, and it's a great picture. It's a great service offering, but when you start diving into things, notice service health. Hey, here's 3 advisories. Degraded services often aren't counting against those uptime guarantees. In fact, when you start talking about individual devices and issues with your devices, that's on you. That's not going to count against this uptime guarantee and quality of service. And your ability to really start diving into things, most of your issues are going to be on your side, and it's going to be, I hope you're not laying off the people who should be managing the service, because they're still, like I mentioned at the beginning, 3/4 of what you're doing with teams is on you. So it's important that you're actually looking at things holistically, really trying to understand what's happening. And I just want to kind of point out, even with Twitter, here's Microsoft 365 status, tweeting out, hey, we have degraded service, as an example. I was diving into a couple of these messages, and I was looking at, hey, Microsoft saying, all right, we got it fixed. And then you look at the tweet responses, and people are like, thanks. Too bad it only took 11 hours. You know, I understand people want to beat up Microsoft, but when you start talking about reality, sometimes it does take a while to get resolution to some of these issues. And so when you're trying to look at things and saying, hey, was it up? Well, maybe it was pingable, but you're actually getting degraded some aspect of the service that is or isn't working. And the onus is on you for understanding when things are getting rolled out, to be on top of that. So that's where the community really is important, and being able to tap into what is Microsoft releasing. You now have the onus of staying on the cutting edge, and essentially being able to really understand and get your arms around what's going on. If you're not familiar with Twitter, now's a good time to get on Twitter and to follow M365 or MSFT365 status. That account is a great one to be able to kind of dive in and actually see history. And you can see it right there in black and white, what the issues have been and how long it took to get service restored. Go next one. And there is an app, by the way, and there's a link there if you get these slides. I think we do have, yeah. Anyway, go ahead. Let's move to that. Is that the last slide? It looks like it didn't get the update. I just want to open it up for questions. Feel free to put things in the chat box. If you are interested in contacting ENow, Jay or Bryce, you want to give them where they should be, how they should contact you? There we go. Thanks, Bryce.
Absolutely. Oh, go ahead, Jay.
No, I'm good. I'm just grateful, Joel, for you delivering so much knowledge and hopefully opening people's eyes up to the breadth and depth of all the many things that we have to do to support teams.
There's a lot here, and trying to fit this all into 1 hour is pretty mind-blowing. And I'm sure you were like, wow, this is a lot coming through the fire hose. But I hope that what this did is it gave you a few notes, a few action items of things to look at, kind of dive deeper in on some of these 5 areas. And I appreciate everybody who was able to join us today. We do have time for some questions. One question I'm seeing says around archiving. So the Microsoft 365 group and archiving. The question is, how do I enable Microsoft 365 Teams archiving? So if you're looking for that feature inside of Teams, it's interesting. You're not going to see it. It's actually in the Azure AD portal. So you actually have to log into that to be able to manage the archiving. And it also, that particular feature does require that you have the Azure AD P1 license for your admins that are configuring that. If you've got E5 for all your users, you're good to go too. You can actually use the naming standards. You can use the archiving features, but these things are not on by default, as I mentioned in the session.
Cool. And I think we got one other question too. How does your tool compare to natively what Microsoft offers? Jay, this is a question for you.
Yeah, I would say, the Microsoft tools give you a good start. A couple of the tools that we often hear about are the Service Health Dashboard. The challenge there is it tends to be a little delayed, and I think that's why people go to Twitter, as Joel pointed out. I know System Center Operation Manager has a management pack. kind of where we're different is we do a lot of synthetic transactions. Like I showed you with the Sharepoint and OneDrive, we get really granular. Same thing with every workload. We're diving into that. And then from a reporting standpoint, Microsoft gives you a good start with the reports, but then to customize it, either you have to learn Power BI, kind of dig into it. There's data storage limits, depending on what type of license you have. So Microsoft's done a great job of creating these gaps for ISVs like us to fill, so they can continue to give you guys tons of features to go figure out. So it's a great little evolution. They're creating new technology. There's always, pros and cons with technology. There's challenges to solve. So we're grateful for the partnership with Microsoft. If there's more detailed questions, please reach out to us at productinfo@enowsoftware.com. Happy to talk some more.
Yeah, you want to put up that slide one more time?
Absolutely.
For anybody who's looking. As well, if anybody who's on who was like, hey, I want to learn about the next time you're going to do a webinar like this, feel free to follow me on LinkedIn or Twitter. I absolutely try and tweet every webinar that I'm on and post something on LinkedIn. My blog is collabshow.com. My name is I'm actually, it shouldn't be hard to find me. Search for my name on the internet, and it's very easy to find my LinkedIn and Twitter. But, great, so great doing this. Hey, thanks for the opportunity, Jay, Bryce. This is good stuff. Thanks so much.
Yeah,
Thanks, guys.
absolutely. Yeah, thank you. And I know we got a few other questions here, so any unanswered questions, rest assured we will follow up with you. Again, thank you to everyone so much for joining us. Jay, Joel, thank you so much. And hey, everyone have a wonderful rest of your day. If you're nearing the end, or if you're just starting your day, have a great day as well. So thanks all, and talk to you again soon.
Thanks, guys. Have a great day.